Over to you, Adam.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's good morning for most of you, perhaps afternoon to some of you dialing in from the East Coast. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for our webinar on FIRB. My name's Adam Handley. I'm the president of ACBC WA, and you'll see on your screen there also China Markets Leader for MinterEllison, but I'm wearing my ACBC WA hat today, so I think I have the easy job of moderating today's FIRB session. So thank you very much to all of you who are joining us, and I think we're expecting some 70 participants on the webinar today. I'd like to thank in particular MinterEllison and Argonaut for being prepared to come and share their views on FIRB today. Two firms, both Argonaut and MinterEllison, who are certainly at the forefront of foreign investment review issues at the moment, particularly in the soft resources and hard resources space in Western Australia, but more broadly across the country. So thank you very much for them for joining us. Could I also note today, for everyone's benefit, that the webinar is being recorded, and so when you ask your questions through the Q&A panel later, and Alex will explain how that works in a minute, I'd just like to note that there'll be a recording of those questions and responses. We have a little less than 1 hour today. It's ambitious to seek to tackle this topic in 1 hour to discuss FIRB issues, and we've divided today's webinar into roughly 2 segments. Firstly, for around about half an hour, you'll hear from speakers from Argonaut and MinterEllison talking about these issues, and then for the last half an hour, we will break into a member Q&A session where you can ask questions or provide comments to the panel, and the panel will respond to them. So you'll hear from MinterEllison not only in relation to legal issues, but you'll also hear from on the ground in Beijing about some of the Chinese investors' perception towards the last few rounds of foreign investment review screening changes, and you'll hear from MinterEllison about some of the legal issues and tips and traps for FIRB, and similarly from Argonaut Capital in relation to their perception in relation to these issues. So I think it's trite to say that there's a heightened sense of tension in Australia and China at the moment. The bilateral relationship is tense, I think everyone would acknowledge, with a number of trade and investment measures both potentially becoming lightning rods for further discontent and deterioration in the relationship between China and Australia. And I think that the further tightening of the foreign investment review screening regime in Australia has the potential to be one of those lightning rod issues, which, if not properly understood and put into context, will add ballast to the deterioration in that relationship. So today we're really pleased to be able to put some of the FIRB issues in context and hear from Minters and Argonaut in relation to their views, including on some of the more sensitive recent transactions around Northern Minerals and others that I know that both those firms have been involved in. Before I sum up and pass to our first speaker, I'd just like to ask Alex Gibb for ACBC just to give you a quick overview of the functionality for today, in particular the Q&A functionality.
Great, thanks Adam. Thank you. So today, if you're having any challenges with audio settings, there is a settings feature in the bottom left of your screen, funnily enough called audio settings. So if you just click into there, you're able to test and make sure everything works for you. Now, in relation to the chat feature, we're encouraging everyone to share their contact details as if you're meeting people at a face-to-face event. So please share what you do and your contact details through the chat to connect with others on the webinar today. And then any questions you have, please exclusively send them through the Q&A function, because if you post them into the chat, they can sometimes get lost. So yeah, so any questions post throughout, they can be throughout the whole session. We'll post in the Q&A, and then Adam will moderate those questions in the Q&A section of today's webinar. And that's about it. So back to you, Adam.
Thanks very much, Alex. So having had the benefit, colleagues, of hearing from our speakers today, I'd like to, without stealing their thunder, note that there really are 2 key messages that we're seeking for you to take away from today's discussion. Firstly is that, contrary to a lot of the media speculation, not all foreign investment deals, including from China, require FIRB and Treasury approval. That's our first point. And the second point is that even if the deal that you're looking at does need approval, deals can and are still being approved when they are from China. Again, that's contrary to a lot of the media speculation about the effect of the recent changes. So Looking forward to a great discussion today. Thank you again to our panellists. I won't introduce each of them individually in the interest of time. You've seen their bios in the webinar invitation sent out for today. So we'll just move through now to our first speaker, Mr. Rigg from Argonaut Capital. Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and for those people on the East Coast, good afternoon. Thank you to the ACBC and also to my good friend Adam Handley. I've known Adam for a long time. We've worked very successfully together. It's a pleasure to be a panellist with Minters and also with my colleague Peter Balsarini on this very interesting topic of the FIRB and the changes and the tensions that some of the actions the FIRB are doing to exacerbate relationships with people internationally and in particular with China. But as I said, my name's Rigg. I'm the Exec Chairman of Argonaut. For those people who don't know, Argonaut is a specialist investment banking and stockbroking firm. We focus on natural resources, and by that I mean metals and mining, the energy commodities and agribusiness, and Pete's our specialist in the agribusiness area. Just want to remind people that my comments and opinions and those of mine and also Pete Balsarini are those of Argonauts and ours personally. So let's just jump into the way in which we're seeing it. And my presentation is more around sort of setting the scene, and you'll get some more technical input as to transactions from Bryn later on in this webinar. So in our view, Australia is walking a tightrope balancing the national interests of priority in its relationship with China. On one side, we have, in Australia, we have our traditional Western values. We have populism, which is something which perhaps doesn't happen in China, and that is people get elected and they got to be popular. And sometimes they do things which are short-termism as against the best interests of the country in the long term. We also have our historical military alliances. And in my view, and this one might create some controversy, there's a distinct lack of knowledge, particularly on the east coast of Australia, as to what are the economic drivers for prosperity in this country. What makes Australia great? And sometimes I think that people don't appreciate what makes this country great. On the other side, we need to think about, if we do the wrong thing here, that there's jobs, implications for jobs. There's implications for economic prosperity. Of course, we also got national security concerns, and they're concerns which should always remain there. And also we've got the China influence. In a day, communism versus democracy, and China's desire to keep expanding its influence on the world. For our view is that FIRB and what the change of FIRB is a very blunt instrument, and we believe, and we'll talk about this, is that it has the implications to actually adverse impact jobs and the economic prosperity of Australia. I think it's always worthwhile to try and try and demonstrate to people, and perhaps this should happen more in Australia, to understand how important China is as a partner to Australia. And on the left-hand side of this table here, we show China's share of global commodity demand. And people need to remember that, at the end of the day, China is consuming in the raw commodity over 50%, or around 50% of some of the most important commodities in the world, such as iron ore, copper, lithium, bauxite, and met coal. And then we come across here onto the other side and see what is the value of the Australian export. Our biggest export's iron ore. We know that. It's $77.2 billion, and 63 billion of that goes to China. So this relationship we have with China is particularly important, and the correlation between foreign investment into Australia and also wages, the correlation is particularly high, and I'll talk about that in my next couple of slides. So, China's commodity demand is not just important, it's essential for Australia's COVID-19 recovery, just like it was in the GFC. And our concern is perhaps some of these third changes may undermine this. In times of crisis, funds typically are repatriated to their home markets to shore up their local economies, to shore up their balance sheets. And we saw that during the GFC, when money, particularly in Europe and the UK, rapidly repatriated back to those countries out of Australia. We saw it maybe to a lesser extent, money repatriating back to North America. But what was balancing all that was this enormous inflow of funds from China. hence why Australia was one of the best countries to handle the impact of the GFC. And perhaps even in places like WA, there was almost no impact. So other than for about 5 months, there was virtually no impact. And it was interesting enough on that, is that the first $100 million capital raising ever done after the GFC, anywhere in the world, was done out of Perth. So it just gives you an idea how West Australia was insulated by that. One of the comments I put at the top of this slide is that if you're good enough to be a customer, but you're not good enough to be a partner or a co-owner, I find this concept that we want people, foreign investors, to be customers of us, but not prepared to be owners. I find that a difficult matter to reconcile in my mind. Yesterday, and this is quite useful, that yesterday the Australian Government Productivity Commission made various statements about FIRB. And for those people who don't know, the Productivity Commission is an Australian government independent research and advisory body in a range of economic, social, environmental issues affecting the welfare of Australians. So this is an Australian government body. It is independently thinking. So these are some of the comments they made yesterday, and I've got to say it's almost like they read some of my notes. That the federal government's foreign investment review system imposes too many conditions. It's unusually secretive, and it's potentially deferring offshore investment and reducing the incomes of Australia. So this body is saying that what FIRB is doing is going to reduce the incomes of Australia. Second point is national security interest and China influence. But they know for the first time one of our largest sources of foreign investment, China, is not a democracy or a military ally. And I think that's what's a challenging thing for us to deal with. And we're going to work out how does FIRB work to make sure that things which aren't national security interests aren't affected by the changes which were made to FIRB. They also made a comment which was very interesting in this report, was that espionage, sabotage, hacking, all those sort of things can be done by Australian and Australian-owned businesses. And the relevant question for FIRB is the extent to which these allowing investments increases the likelihood of security risk over and above the pre-existing risk in the absence of the foreign investment. A couple of statements I really like in this presentation, which I hope will get a lot more publicity, and perhaps it won't because it makes too much economic sense, is that as the economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, the role of foreign investment will be more crucial than ever. And this is a comment which I've made about the GFC and why Australia was able to handle the GFC. The third point there, to the extent that foreign investment proposals are blocked or discouraged, this results in lower Australian incomes. And so I think what we'll see here is that as people become aware of the impacts, the negative impacts on their way of life, that they will be more welcoming to foreign investment and investment from China. Because as I've noted, the amount of investment coming from Europe has been repatriated back there. And I've got to say, I think the US is in a lot more trouble perhaps now than perhaps they might have been after the GFC. Some of the comments I made just quickly was that we've got a really restrictive, so of the 36 most advanced economies, we're the 5th most restrictive in terms of foreign investment. And the other comment, which is the last comment, which is very important, and it's important because of certainty, is that the Productivity Commission is saying there needs to be publication for the reasons for why transactions are blocked. There's a greater certainty around timelines and aligning application fees with actually the cost of administering the screening process. And they said by doing this, you increase transparency, enhance predictability, and lower the cost of screening the regime. So it's really interesting that the Productivity Commission's come out here and it's largely in line with the thinking of Argonaut, and I understand ministers as well. So despite the challenges posed by FIRB, we think there's still outcomes you can achieve. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But the key point, which I believe, is that once the economic imperative is properly appreciated, there's little doubt that FIRB rules will revert to the previous balanced approval process. Perhaps not so much on particularly security, sensitive security assets, but definitely in relation to general investment. I want to emphasise that China's outsized commodity demand and capital inflows drove Australia's GFC outperformance. And once again, if we don't have someone else, it's not China, who else is going to do that to help us out of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic? In our view, changes to the FIRB framework have the potential to cause significant damage to Australia's economy and resources sector, as I just said. The damage can undermine the effective recovery of Australia to overcome this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I make particular reference to resources. There's a number of resource project developers usually require off-take agreements, i.e. long-term agreements with their customers to secure project financing. Regularly, equity funding comes with the off-take partners. So, at the moment, we're unsure whether that will be approved by FIRB and to what timeframe. This lengthy and expensive process may see projects go unfunded and Australian jobs lost. We also make comment that the 6-month timeframe is just not workable for listed companies. It just undermines the integrity of the ASX. Just to put some other things about the ASX is a generally unbelievably good exchange globally. And in terms of resources, last year, the ASX, $1 in every $3 raised resource projects globally was raised on the ASX. So if we're causing a problem in Australia such that it's undermining the integrity of the ASX, the whole global industry for resources is being undermined. And just one thing is that for small miners and explorers who have had historically trouble attracting funds or for various reasons can't attract funds, an overseas investment is often the difference between survival and failure. And I've personally witnessed this. We're involved in a company called Innova Metals. The company was facing an insolvency situation earlier this year. We've had a cornerstone investor from China, Zhongbao, and that company has, their money's come in, it's turned the success of that company around. The share price is up 300%, and that company now has a future developing over all things a project in the US. But let me tell you that if that company was facing failure and Australian shareholders are going to lose all their money, but for Zhongbao coming in. It's important and it's something which will never change. Capital is mobile and it goes to where it's made most welcome. If you don't make capital welcome here, it will go elsewhere. And there's lots of other undeveloped iron ore projects and other projects around the world where China can apply its money to. When one of the objectives of the talk today is to talk about is there other ways of doing transactions and ensuring that we can still get foreign investment approval or get foreign investment into Australia. Yes, there is. And one of the ways, as Adam mentioned, is that we can go through FIRB. Yes, it's lengthy, but it can achieve the desired outcome. We can also do alternative structures. And one of the things in mining is that we can do the right to mine, right to mill arrangements. They're not always suitable, and I think Bryn will talk about some of the nuances of that type of transaction. Or you can do structured investments. And this is where the equity investment remains below the necessary threshold until the approvals process reverts to the norm and then the funding converts to equity. We do, and all these are perhaps transitional and a bit more complicated than necessary, but we do believe that you should consider these because we do not recommend waiting for the changes that opportunities can evaporate. Yeah, alternative and structured investments can lock you in to the investment you want, albeit not quite in the structure you want. It allows you to lock yourself in there, block anyone else from taking advantage of that opportunity, and position yourself that when the inevitable positive changes happen to FIRB. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of my talk. I look forward to any questions at the end of the session. I'm now looking very much forward to listening to Bea in Mrs. Beijing office. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Yes, as you said, happy to introduce now Bea Chen, Chief Rep for Minter's Beijing office, and Bea, very keen to hear your perspective on the Chinese investor perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bea. I'm based in Beijing, and I'm working with Chinese clients on outbound China investments. So here to share some of my observations in this market. In the last few months, we saw, I think that the outbound transaction has obviously slowed down, which was contributed by a few factors. Firstly, the tightening of the FIRB regime means, I think, greater difficulties and uncertainty in getting the FIRB approvals which is also associated with the Chinese sort of internal decision making. When they feel they're not comfortable of getting, or they're not likely to get FIRB approval, that sort of decision making process internally becomes a very, very difficult one. So some of the deals you might not even get to the submit your non-binding offer, and the deal has been sort of being abandoned internally. That was because I think obviously the tightening of FIRB regime. And secondly, the perception of the Chinese investors will be more difficult to getting the FIRB approval, makes the Chinese investors sort of in a disadvantaged position in a competitive bidding process. So that is actually quite important. When recently we were seeing some transactions, there's many Chinese bidders in the process, but every one of them actually are concerned about how they will be perceived by the seller. If there are bidders from other countries, will Chinese bidders will be looked upon unfavorably in terms of the FIRB approval and getting the regulatory approval. That is one major concern. And thirdly, the ambiguity around the national security test has heightened sort of fear from the Chinese investors' perspective, and they fear it will be applied very broadly on industries that wouldn't be previously captured. So it's the sort of national security test in the perception of some of the Chinese investors is quite negative, and including the recently announced FIRB changes, which also are perceived as aimed at restricting Chinese investment. Though the government has stated these new rules would be contract agnostic, but the sort of the Australian media reports and the Chinese media reporting both has made the Chinese investors have this perception that some of these changes are targeted to Chinese. Despite all these, I think the other sort of physical barrier or physical challenges for Chinese investors is obviously the shutdown, and because of the COVID-19, the travel restrictions also made it very, very challenging for Chinese investors to evaluate potential acquisitions without being able to go to Australia and do the site visit. That hopefully will change very soon. But interestingly, despite all these concerns, I mean, I've got numerous calls and I've attended numerous meetings and just with Chinese clients and explained to them what this FIRB change means and how this is going to impact their investment, and we're trying to give them very, very sort of positive messages. Despite all these concerns and they have politically and legally, I think their appetite in investing in Australia remains very, very strong. Particularly I've seen in the renewable energy sector, very, very strong interest. Some recent bid, I know there's more than 10 bidders, all from China for one project. So, but how many of those Chinese bidders will get to the second round or even putting in a bid, and that's really largely depends on how comfortable they feel about getting the FIRB approval, because that is sort of the key part of their internal decision-making process. In China, most of the investors are SOEs, and so they have a sort of lengthy investment decision process. And the FIRB has not made it easy for them to make a decision, honestly. Yeah. So that's basically what's happening in the ground. We're still very hopeful that the big picture is, going forward is still mutual sort of beneficial trade and cultural relationship between Australia and China, and we're working to convey sort of positive messages to investors and to tell them what's behind this national security test and all these proposed FIRB changes. But the perception is there, I have to say. The concerns are there, and there are increasing concerns about investment into Australia. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bea. Really appreciate your perspectives and looking forward to a few questions directed your way during the Q&A session as well. Now I'm pleased to shift focus a little bit into the agricultural sector and hear from Pete Balsarini from Argonaut in relation to his perspective on the ag sector and FIRB.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Balsarini. I'm a director here at Argonaut, and as Eddie mentioned, I focus primarily in the agricultural sector. And I've been asked to briefly speak about that today, and more notably the foreign investment into Australian agriculture. Argonaut has an extensive experience and skill set in ag. We see it as a natural extension of our natural resources focus, and over the last 5 to 7 years, we've completed a number of transactions across a number of agricultural verticals. In terms of foreign investment into Australian agriculture, a couple of facts. 12% of Australia's GDP comes from ag, and 13% of Australia's total export income actually comes from ag. So look, it's meaningful to Australia. It's probably not in the stratosphere of sort of mining and metals, but it is certainly significant. But if you flip it to the industry level, approximately 65% of all Australia's agricultural product is exported. So the connection to foreign capital is very important. And has been very important over a number of years, and we would like to think will continue to be very important into the future. I guess we mentioned before, and Eddie touched on it, that populism and political environment. I mean, I think that plays even more heavily into that agricultural land ownership piece. It's a very emotive issue, stirs passions. The perception that Australia's selling the farm, and the impact that has. And I knew a gentleman who used to talk about politicians and populist causes and simplistic solutions, and sometimes that can be the case. But to put some context to that, 13% of Australia's land mass is owned by foreigners. China owns 2.2% of the ag land. So the family farming unit is still the dominant family farming unit, and it's not corporatised. And there's a large degree of symmetry between the export income, which was 13%, and the foreign ownership of land, 13%. So you would hardly suggest that it's outweighed at the current time. I think there's a perception, from the outside that foreign investment into agriculture is driven by this food security angle, the so-called foreign government that needs to, keep the people happy by keeping their bellies full. And it's true there has been transactions of this nature in Australia over the last decade, but really that's not driving the investment. The reality is much more about simplistic or not so simplistic, but investment return, portfolio construction. Australia's agriculture has a clean green image, relatively low risk, but in essence low return as well. But there has been a continued land appreciation over a number of years, and in a world sense, that land appreciation is coming off a relatively low base. So that attracts parties. We've seen a whole lot of patient money come into Australia over the last number of years, primarily, to be honest, from US and Canadian pension funds through sale and leaseback transactions on land operations. So again, a difference between that sort of perception and reality. I'll move a little bit to the impacts of COVID-19. And, in a perverse way and in a relative sense, Australian agriculture looks like it's going to be a beneficiary of the COVID-19 outcome from an overall perspective. The factors I mentioned before, the clean green, low risk land appreciation, I think have been enhanced through this process, and that relates to Australia's management of the COVID-19 environment compared to potentially some of the other competitors in the agricultural sectors. There's probably been a few notable exceptions. I guess the one significant exception has been the Cedar Meats abattoir in Melbourne that was shut down for a COVID-19 outbreak. But if you look at what happened in the US, there were a number of large processes that had to be shut down and caused significant impact to their agricultural supply chain. To highlight this point, we've actually seen, from anecdotally, Argonaut has seen additional inquiry from foreign entities looking for investment into agriculture over the last 3 months, and perhaps that, similar to, B's comments in relation to, Chinese investors and their interest in investing outside or into Australia. And we've also seen increased interest from domestic investors recognising the investment opportunity in Australian ag. Look, I guess, there also has to be a balance there. There obviously is some downsides. Travel restrictions, again, as been mentioned, that certainly does slow down potential deals. There's obviously a travel component when you're referring to agricultural opportunities. And the FIRB changes that we're well aware of, the $0 threshold on all land and the small threshold on agricultural business, obviously clouds opportunity for foreign investors. And I think the other big impact is the 6-month ability for FIRB to review an application, which seems outrageous, to be honest, and certainly creates uncertainty. On top of all this, you've also got a China-Australian relationship, at least at the political level, that I guess could be described as rocky. And agriculture has been right at the forefront of this. I mean, I'm sure people would be aware that there was a barley tariff of 80% put to Australian barley that's effectively halted all exports of Australian barley to China. And the other, I guess, well-documented issue was the suspension of 4 East Coast abattoirs that had Chinese licenses, so they can no longer export to China until such time as that suspension is lifted. Now, it's not my position to opine on the motivations for these happenings, but what is evident is that such actions do have a ripple effect through the industry and decrease the confidence on both sides of the fence. I mean, obviously, from an Australian perspective, it causes issues, but it also causes issues for participants in the Chinese food sector who are looking to buy Australian agriculture or invest into Australian agriculture, and whether they'll be able to execute on that offtake. As an aside, one of the 4 suspended abattoirs was a company called Kilcoy in Queensland. It's in fact Chinese owned, showing that all players, regardless of nationality, are impacted by these events. I think it's important to recognise that agricultural products are perhaps more interchangeable as an export to China than potentially some Australian resource products. So what I mean by that is that it is possible for the Chinese to source their agricultural products from other places, and that means they are more prone to be involved, that Australian agricultural products are more prone to be involved in these types of trade tensions. Today's not about telling you what you can't do, it's about telling you what you can do, and shortly Bryn from MinterEllison will expand on some of the structures and methodologies across the sector that we're looking at to facilitate these investments. But to round out a couple of points in relation to future foreign investment in agriculture, we believe there will be continued demand for foreign entities to be involved, and China will definitely be a part of this. The trade tensions will continue to impact, there's no doubt about that, and yes, the current FIRB issues will potentially impact on people's thought processes around transactions in the short term. However, we believe that there will be continued demand, parties will need to continue to make the case, there'll need to be alternate structures and structured investments put into place, but the benefits to both the Australian economy and to the Chinese investors and economy are real, and you would like to think that at a point in time, the adults will get back in the room, FIRB will actually come back to where it needs to be. I think Eddie's point about the Product Community Commission's release this week provides encouragement in this form. So look, that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions at the end, happy to help, but hopefully that's given people a little bit of an insight into ag, and I'll pass back to Adam.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm going to move straight to Bryn Davis, partner at MinterEllison, I think he's got the hardest job today, including within a limited time frame, to give us some sense as to what deals can get through and what deals don't need approval. So Bryn, I'll hand to you, please.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, ACBC, for giving us the opportunity to speak today. I've got one slide that should hopefully be coming up shortly on the screen. But broadly, as Adam mentioned, what I wanted to sort of talk about today was in this uncertain FIRB environment, facing all the challenges that foreign investment is facing at the moment, how can we actually go and get some deals done? How can we make some transactions happen despite all of those challenges? So sorry, Alex, I'm not sure if that slide has come up yet.
Yep, it's on. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I just can't see it online. So what I'm really going to talk about today is really, first of all, the specific challenges. Second of all, the broad strategies that you can take in terms of trying to manage them. And then we can drill down a little bit further into some of the specific actions. So what are the challenges that are really facing investors at this point? And we don't need to go over them again. The FIRB monetary threshold has been reduced down to $0 for all foreign investment. This isn't really an issue for foreign government investors who already had a $0 threshold, but it is very relevant for plenty of other foreign investors as well. Oh, sorry, now it's come up. The second point, which, and this is rehashing some of what Eddie has said, is that the real timing here is a problem too. 6 months as a statutory review period will be a real challenge for many investors in the timeframes that either targets or issuing companies need to have their transactions done by. So that's a real challenge too. And then the last challenge there that I've talked about is sort of some specific sensitivities that have sort of evolved and we have at the moment. One of the big ones is the introduction of a critical minerals list in Australia. That's a list of 33 minerals which the government considers to be critical to Australia's national interest, and they have demonstrated a real conscientious approach to ensuring a level of control and influence over the supply chains of those minerals. Agribusiness is always a particular area of sensitivity. Other speakers have talked about some of the geopolitical sensitivities at the moment, particularly with Australia and China and the US relationship. And then in addition, one of the other challenges that many foreign investors find in this space is that the foreign investment rules are highly complex, difficult to really understand, seem to capture a lot of transactions that they don't really feel like they ought to be capturing, and the rules seem to be changing fairly regularly. The FIRB Act changed in 2015. It changed again through multiple variations between then and this year, and we've only recently had FIRB come out and say that they're doing another overhaul of the foreign investment regime later this year to effectively come in at 1 January next year. So it's a constantly moving set of goalposts that foreign investors are asked to thread the needle through, with some relatively significant consequences for not getting it right. So if that's the environment that we've got a lot of challenges there to try and manage. What are the broad strategies that investors can use in that scenario? And broadly, they fall into two kind of buckets. The first one is, what are the things that you can do that don't require Foreign Investment Review Board notification or approval? So I mentioned before that the FIRB monetary thresholds have reduced to $0. In a practical sense, what that means is that the government went through the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act, and they went through the regulations that attach to it, and effectively did a word search for dollars and replaced all of them with zero. So what that means is that all the monetary thresholds are zero, but the specific exemptions that are captured in the regs and the Act still continue to apply. So what that means is that there's a range of various contractual rights or portfolio type investments that can be made that fall within specific exemptions and therefore allow potentially millions of dollars to be invested without having to go through that FIRB process. So that first strategy, find a transaction that doesn't need FIRB approval, is about trying to work out what you can do now and assessing what the strategic benefits of that would be for you as a foreign investor. So for instance, Eddie actually touched on one of these before, which is about structured investments. So for instance, there's a specific exemption in in the foreign investment regime for portfolio investments, which basically means less than 10% in a listed company, no rights to participate on the board, and so on. So in that context, some level of investment can be made. It might not be the level of investment that a foreign investor would want. They may want 20 or 30 or 40 or 100%, but strategically a 10% stake can be strategically powerful in that context. And so it's important that investors understand some of those strategic benefits. Being able to come in as a 10% shareholder positions you with a blocking stake in respect of, a takeover of that company. Having a 10% shareholding that you may get at a discount to market may help you average down your cost overall for future acquisitions. Being a 10% shareholder may give you some soft levels of access to information or access to individuals in those companies that would help you position for other things that you may be interested in developing, whether it's an offtake relationship or something to that effect. So I think it's important to understand what you can do and what the strategic benefits can be to a foreign investor of being able to do that. Another one that Eddie mentioned that I think is probably worth touching on here is about the capacity of an investor to lock in a price. So for instance, you are permitted as a foreign investor to advance funds, advance money as a loan, and have various conversion rights subject to obtaining the necessary FIRB approvals. Now, you need to take some care about how you do that to make sure that it complies with the regime. But that is one way of allowing funds to go into a company, allowing the price of a conversion or the price of the equity to be negotiated at that point, and effectively lock in that price at the point in time when the company really needs it. And so that's something that's worth considering. And depending on the target, there are other more sophisticated ways to do it. You can use cash settled equity swaps or other derivatives, provided that they don't give you an equitable interest in the actual share. They remain as a contractual arrangement with a provider of that derivative. And in that circumstance, an investor can give themselves a level of price protection in respect of their investments. And it can also
Bryn, I apologise for interrupting you. I'm just conscious of time. We'll probably, and I know earlier speakers have run a bit over. I think you've got a couple more minutes before we need to move to Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've got the point there on what transaction, the strategy, the strategic benefits of that. The other point is managing the FIRB process. So 10 years ago, the approach to dealing with FIRB was that if there was a significant transaction, you would engage at the highest level that you could possibly try in the government to understand any particular FIRB sensitivities to that investment and whether it was going to be a problem from a FIRB perspective. That's what we might call a top-down approach to trying to get through the FIRB regime. As FIRB became, started to approve things more, and it became a little more certain and a little more clear as to what was going to be approved and what wouldn't, it sort of flipped, and at the bureaucratic level, they started to go through the FIRB process a little more on a more regularised basis, which would probably be more described as a bottom-up approach. You go in at the case officer level and things get escalated if it's required. What we've seen is that because of the various challenges and the geopolitical uncertainties facing a lot of foreign investors, is that if you're going to manage such challenges effectively, you'll benefit from being able to back to a strategy, and it's going to make relations and people who have connections into those levels of government particularly valuable in ensuring that investments that do need FIRB approval and are only going to proceed with a FIRB approval, that those investors have, a clear understanding upfront whether there are particular issues and problems or matters that need to be managed in that FIRB process. So I think that in that context, the while the general advice around starting the process early, talking to the relevant stakeholders is all the same, I think what we're going to see in this context is the real importance of having a top-down approach in terms of engagement with FIRB and government on particularly sensitive investments. So that's running through very quickly the last of the points. That probably leaves us with 12 minutes or so for questions, Adam. So I hope that's been enough, and obviously I'm happy to answer questions.
No, thanks very much, Bryn. I think we asked you to truncate your time a little bit as we'd run over with some other speakers, so I apologise for doing that to you. Look, yeah, moving into Q&A. So we've got some questions being logged through the Q&A, thank you, and a couple have come through on the chat to me as well. I'll address this one maybe to Eddie and to Bryn, because I know, Eddie, you've got a particular bugbear on this issue as well. But one of the questions is for a listed company in Australia, if their main assets are in overseas jurisdictions, including in this example the US, will it be easier to get FIRB approval, or does that not make any difference anymore? So maybe Eddie, you can give your response to that, and then Bryn, I'll ask you to give a legal response to that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and I apologise. I think I was the person who went overtime. Look, it's interesting. I would have said naturally it would be easier, but the AVZ decision confuses me, but I think Bryn can talk about it. It should make it easy because the company is not an Australian Land Corporation. In our instance, the investor is not an FGI. It's clearly not a national security interest issue. It's gold, so it's not a strategic metal, and it's not a mine yet. So it's almost unfathomable that there'd be an issue with FIRB. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to jinx myself with that. We're launching the application today or tomorrow. So hopefully there's no issues, but perhaps Bryn gives a legal view.
Oh, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, look, I think you covered the main legal points on that one, Eddie. Mainly around whether it's an Australian Land Corporation and so on. I think the AVZ example is a good one. So for those who don't know, the AVZ transaction was one where it was an investment in an Australian listed company that had assets in Africa. In that case, there was an indication of a rejection by the Treasurer, and this was a specific issue. You know, like, these aren't assets in Australia. Why is the government concerned with this? And this in that particular case, it went back to the fact that it was a lithium development, and lithium is a critical mineral. Is obviously one of the particular sensitivities for the government at the moment. And so even though those assets were outside of Australia, the supply chain and the impact that the development of that particular project was going to have on the supply chains for Australia was something that the government considered it would be contrary to the national interest to permit the investment to go through. And now I was involved in that, and I have a different view. But at the end of the day, that's the way that the Treasurer saw that particular case. I agree with Eddie's comments that where the assets are based in the US, and if they're not in that critical minerals category or something else that would be impacting on national security or competition in Australia or something like that, then it should lower the FIRB risk. But I mentioned that AVZ example as one where assets outside Australia were still relevant to the Australian national interest.
Thanks very much, Bryn. Question from Peter Chong. Peter's a long-serving member on the ACBC executive and leader of KPMG's China group here in Perth. A great question, which, if I can summarise it, is basically noting that we've seen over the past 3 years an increase in US investment applications into Australia and a decline in Chinese investments. And I'll give KPMG a plug for their Demystifying China's Investment report. If you haven't read that, it's become the sort of seminal statistical guide on Chinese investment stats year on year. So well done, KPMG. But Peter asks, is there a degree of hubris behind the federal government's changes to FIRB, assuming perhaps that US investment will increase year on year and therefore we don't need China as much as we perhaps needed to historically? I might ask that question of Eddie, but before I ask you to reply, Eddie, I'll just, I guess, note that we recently released our MinterEllison Foreign Bank Tracker, which is starting to show a trend that we saw after the global financial crisis, which was North American and European capital starting to exit from Australia. So I think that we would rely upon that increase in US investment year on year to the exclusion of China with some degree of concern. Peter, that's my perspective. But Eddie, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Adam. I mean, I think I mentioned the example after the GFC. In times of crisis, money does repatriate. In the US, we've got an election later this year. I do think there will be a desire to ensure that the US economy is strong and people returning their money to ensure their own balance sheets and ensure their own domestic operations are strong. And we saw counter to that, we saw the Chinese actually put money into Australia after the GFC. But that's an example, and COVID-19 is going to cause another obviously global crisis. You'd expect US money, and you already said the trend's already starting. I do think that the US economy and what's happening in COVID-19 there, that there's going to be a lot of stresses in that country. And I do think that there is a certain isolationist policy done by the Trump administration. So I would expect that US investment in Australia will reduce. And so we need to fuel that because, as the Productivity Commission said, foreign investment, the correlation between foreign investment in Australia and household income is completely correlated. So if that drops, people's household income is going to drop. So I don't think people like spending less in Australia. That's just my style. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, on that point, the ACBC used to, I think we discontinued it 2 years ago, but we used to do an annual trade household report, which talked about the value of Chinese trade, not investment, but trade, for Australian households. And I think the last time we did the report, it was something like every Australian household benefits from Chinese trade to the tune of $12,000 or $14,500 per household. So I would certainly echo those comments. Pete, a question for you has come through in relation to the recent trade tensions, particularly around beef. And the question was, what do you think the recent Chinese suspension of beef imports from Australian abattoirs means for China's propensity to want to invest in Australian agri-assets?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Look, I think what beef and protein more generally is a commodity market across the world, and the ability to interchange. I was trying to make that point in my presentation. The ability to interchange from one source to another is real and present, and that creates different gaps for different opportunities. But I think the reality we've already seen, and I've already had discussions with Chinese parties who are looking at or have existing relationships or are looking to develop relationships in terms of supply, and their concern is about their government, bringing that to an end. So they're considering their business risk and saying, well, I'm potentially better to go to other places in the world. Having said that, it would be fair to say, without trying to be controversial, China's having a number of these types of issues across the world with, the US, Brazil, these types of countries. So, there is a mix in there. But anecdotally, what we're actually seeing is beef out of the US is effectively going to get into China, and there'll be limits to Australian beef. I will caveat that by saying that most beef that goes into China from Australia is very high end. It's not commodity beef. Most commodity beef in Australia goes into other parts of Southeast Asia. So, but in answer to the question, yes, there is an impact, and it's a degree of lower levels of confidence.
Thanks very much, Peter. We've probably got time for only one more question before we wrap up. Can I just mention that on the Q&A it was asked whether or not the slides would be distributed. Yes, they will be. And we've got a couple of questions that have been submitted that we won't have time to cover today. And so we will also provide a document that responds to those questions that are unanswered on the webinar in our follow-up communication with you as well. So B, a question for you. There's a strong desire for, as you've mentioned, for Chinese investment into Australia, and China remains positive towards Australia as an investment destination. what can Australian businesses and indeed business organisations like the ACBC do to attract those investors and help bring their investment funds into Australia?
Thanks, Adam. What I have seen in China is I think Chinese investors are crying for transparency. So the most often questions I've been asked is, in the last 6 months, has any Chinese investment been approved by FIRB? Are there any failure stories? So what is these, how FIRB's going to treat these national security tests, and what is the standard of applying those tests? So I think everybody is asking for questions for transparency. And some of the questions really, we can't really give them a very clear answer. And also we don't have the whole sort of access to the full access to the FIRB's cases. So it's pretty hard to actually tell the Chinese client what has already happened. So I think in going forward, and I think to help Chinese investors to lose those sort of concerns, I mean, the transparency and more information, more education is absolutely the key, I think.
Thank you, Bea. And look, I'd echo those comments and also note that the ACBC, really is calling upon its members and stakeholders to really engage in that second track diplomacy, as it's called, to really help reach out to their Chinese counterparts and help them understand the regime and help them understand that the Australian position at a government level and within businesses that in fact foreign investment is required, needed and encouraged. So colleagues, I'm conscious of time. We like to make sure we finish these webinars on time. So I'm going to draw the questions to a close there. And as I said, we'll follow up with responses to the other questions you can see on the Q&A and also some questions that have been sent to me on the chat function. Could I just take a moment then to thank our speakers from Minters and Argonaut. Thank you very much for your insights today. I'm sure that a number of our participants will be following up with you to ask additional questions and have a chat about these issues. So thank you very much. Can I thank our participants for joining us and also for asking some questions today as well. And could I also thank Tracy Lim, the ACBC WA CEO, and Alex Gibb for all of their support in setting up and running the webinar for us today. As I said, look out for a follow-up email that will come through from us with a copy of the slides and a copy of the questions that weren't answered today. And we hope you found it informative and useful, and we look forward to talking to you further. Thank you very much.